Hi, Nicky. Thank you so much for joining me on this podcast. It's so exciting to have you with me today.
It's a privilege to be with you. I'm absolutely delighted.
You were born in Hyde Park Corner in London in 1955, and your mother...
Yeah, that's good knowledge. Hyde Park Corner, that's a very accurate locating.
And your mother, Muriel Margaret Gumbel, was a barrister, and I believe you were born on the day she won her seat as the member of the London Counties Council.
Wow, you really have done your research.
So she was there, and I think because of her political inclination, she was later in the Kensington Chelsea Council. So that's why you got to know Caroline Welby. So that's where all that link started.
Yes.
And then you've got your father, who's Walter Gumbel. He came from a long line of barristers. So it sounds like they had high expectations from you from day one.
Well, I don't know. My father definitely expected me to be a barrister. I don't know whether he had high expectations of me, but he definitely expected me to be a barrister. My parents were amazing. They were a little bit eccentric. My father was 49 when he got married, and my mother was 36. So in some ways, they were a bit more like grandparents. I mean, by the time I was 49, I think I probably almost had grandchildren by that stage. But my father came as a refugee, so he had nothing really when he arrived here. My grandparents were pretty much the last to escape on the kind of last exits from fleeing from the Nazis. So they came with nothing and they sacrificed everything for us. So they were very loving parents. They worked very hard. We never had anything other than secondhand clothes. I do a podcast with my daughter called Faith and Equality. On the podcast, we interviewed my sister, who's now a QC, and she reminded us that one time someone gave her a piece of clothing from Marks and Spencer's for her birthday. And my mother took it back because she knew she could get a refund from Marks and Spencer's. So we got all our clothes in charity shops, and we used to go and buy damaged fruit from the markets, but they saved every penny to educate us and to give us the best possible start in life. So I am hugely, hugely grateful to them.
And I believe in 1969, when you were age 14, you and your sister were walking with your mom along the promenade in Brighton. You had this eventful conversation. Could you share a bit about that?
Yeah. My mother said to us, your father is German and Jewish, and you are never to speak to him about it. So that would have been in 1969, and he died in 1981. And I never spoke to him about it. He never spoke, and I didn't really speak to my mother either. She died in 1986. I felt sort of she, out of respect for him, didn't want to talk about it. So I only really talked a little bit to his sister. My father's sister was 10 years younger, and I did find out a little bit about him from her. And then the Judaica Museum in Berlin wrote, and they were researching my family, and I got a file from them. And then the Israeli ambassador did some research into which concentration camps members of my family had died. And now I can Google them. And there's stuff in Wikipedia that was only in German, but now it's been translated into English, much of it. And I can find out more about them. About Abraham Gumbel, my great-great-great-grandfather, Moses Gumbel, Isaac Gumbel, and even books. I've got books now written. I've got here, so this is, for example, this is my father's cousin, Emil Gumbel, who was a pacifist and professor, and Einstein rescued him after he escaped from Germany into France. He was on Hitler's hit list, him and Einstein and Kafka and various others. There were 32 of them, I think, on, well, Hitler's initial hit list, the people he wanted to kill. And Emil Gumbel escaped, and Einstein got him out from France, then to the US, where he came up with something called the Gumbel distribution. And if you study maths at university, you will study the Gumbel distribution. So yeah, it's fascinating now to find out. It's a whole new world to me. And it's only really, I mean, I read that book in the last year. So I'm now discovering stuff about this extraordinary family who were in Germany in the 1930s, resisting Hitler before he came to power.
Did it never cross your mind when your mom said, don't ask your dad to maybe push the folder a bit?
You couldn't get anywhere near it. So any conversation that was getting anywhere near it, like anything to do with his education, he would immediately turn the subject to the weather. He would say, it's such a sunny day today, or isn't it cold today? That was always his defense, to talk about the weather. And you knew if he was talking about the weather, he was saying, I'm not going there. So we never got anywhere near any conversation about his past life. And, I didn't understand it at the time. I just accepted it, but I didn't understand it. But now I do understand it, because the trauma that they had been through was so huge. He was suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder. The way I sort of try to understand it is 6 million Jews were murdered in the Holocaust, including many of his family, and presumably, I don't know this because I never got the opportunity to ask him, loads of friends of his must have died. And it's like, I suppose it'd be the equivalent of if in the UK, all the Christians were killed, basically, but not just killed in the most inhumane way, starved to death and then put into gas chambers. All the Christians, including many members of my family. And then my children would say to me, oh, how was it? How do you begin to talk about it? And for many of the survivors of that, they started to talk about it in like 2010. So it was like 75 years later, some of them started to say, now I feel I can talk. And I think my father died too early. It was only 36 years after the end of the war that he died. It was too fresh in his memory. He hadn't recovered from it. It was too traumatic, too painful. So the older I've got, the more I respect my father and his wisdom, and things he used to say that now I say to my children and grandchildren. But I was sad because the more I learn about him, the more interesting it would have been. I mean, I was able to get hold of his war record. He joined the army as a private in 1942, and he was a lieutenant colonel by the end of the war. And I think he was interrogating Nazi officers. And it would have been so interesting to find out what he learned. It was just, he had such a fascinating life. And, I think he did know Einstein. I'd love to have known about Albert Einstein. What was he, people he knew, but he couldn't talk about them because the moment he talked, it would have revealed something about his past life. He basically, when he got married, he just said, that is it. My life starts again. Everything before is the past, and the past is a place I'm not going to visit.
Well, he clearly cared so much about you and your sister and wanted to make sure you had the best of everything, because you end up going to Eton.
Well, he wanted the best for us, and he saved up. He wanted me to be a barrister. He didn't want my sister to be a barrister, although, he had married a barrister. My mother was a barrister. He didn't want my sister to be a barrister, which is extraordinary. But she was determined to be a barrister, and she is a highly successful QC now. But she had a real struggle, because it was a very sexist world that she grew up with, and a huge discrimination against women. And it was very hard for her to succeed. But she was so determined that she did, and has succeeded far beyond my father's success, certainly as a barrister, and far beyond, I think, anything any of us could have imagined. She's right at the top of the legal profession now, massively successful and absolutely wonderful, and just an amazing, amazing person.
I heard that podcast episode you mentioned between you, your sister, and Bax, and I was amazed that she has done 10 marathons recently.
Yes.
Incredible.
Yes, between October and Christmas, she ran 10 marathons. She wanted to run 10 marathons in 10 days, but her husband said, I don't think that's a good idea. So she did it in 3 months instead.
So you had your childhood in London, then you end up going to Eton. You were there when you end up labeling yourself as a logical determinist. How did that happen?
I think I just, my father was an agnostic. I didn't have a church-going upbringing. I just thought none of us have any control over the situation into which we're born. None of us have control over the brain, the mind we're born with. Our first action comes out of those, and everything else comes out of what's happened to us. So everything is determined, that you have no control. Therefore, you have no free will. There can't be any such thing as right and wrong. Therefore, there can't be a moral universe. Therefore, there can't be a God. And that was basically my argument. And I became convinced of that, and quite sort of thought that no one had an answer to that. So I just thought Christians were just not facing the logic of the universe as it is.
So I imagine you encompassed all that into this essay you wrote, disproving the existence of God.
Yes, exactly. I put all that down.
Since your dad was so determined that you would be a barrister, and I think the day you were born, your dad spoke to his friend and said, reserve a
Yes.
place for my son. So
Yeah, exactly.
how
Yes.
did you get away with entering Cambridge for an economics degree and not law?
I think I was just very blessed to get into Cambridge. I don't think I deserved to get in at all, but I got in. And the reason I did economics was because the first year of economics at Cambridge was the same as the A-level syllabus. So I knew I would have to do no work at all for the first year, which I did. I literally did zero work for an entire year. And I partied. I've just basically partied in London. And it was just such a waste of the time at Cambridge because I was partying in London while I was supposed to be an undergraduate in Cambridge. And then in February 1974, I encountered Jesus, and that totally changed. I had a pile of invitations like that to parties in London, and I just binned them. And then I just focused on finding out, reading the Bible, discovering more about Jesus, and trying to tell my friends that this is the best news that you could ever hear.
So before February, I think you found your band of brotherhoods, if you were the Five Nickies, and you had your
Yes.
Nicky lunches. How did the five of you find each other? It seems like such an incredible coincidence.
Well, four of us had been at school together, so we knew each other and were friends. These overlap. So four of us were at Trinity, one was at Queen's, and we just became friends. And I don't know, we just thought it was funny that we were all called Nicky. And we had a couple of honorary Nickies. Anthony got on, and Ken Costa became later honorary Nickies, and they were sort of part of it. And we found some young women who were also called Nicky, and they came as well. And we had a lot of fun. We were just sort of very sort of irresponsible. I don't know, irresponsible, but we didn't have any responsibilities. We were carefree and we were having fun.
I think one of the honorary Nickies was Justin Welby.
Justin Welby was pretty much, yes. Justin was the next generation. He was 1 year younger, and he came to Trinity as well the following year, yes. And it has been a wonderful friend ever since, yes.
And so you mentioned February 1974. Can you share what happened?
Well, it was through Nicky and Silla Lee were my closest friends, really. And Nicky, we'd ended up by coincidence having rooms next door to each other, or God incidents, maybe looking back at it, next door to each other. And we were great friends. We did lots of stuff together. But I didn't know that he was investigating Christianity. He knew how hostile I was, and he kept it quiet from me. But he had been investigating really for about 6 months, faith. But he hadn't said anything to me. He and Silla plucked up courage to tell me that they had become Christians. And I really was horrified. But I thought I ought to find out about it. I didn't really know much about it. And that's when I picked up an old Bible I'd had at school for RE. And it was reading the New Testament, really, reading about Jesus. That it was like, as I read about Jesus, it was as if he kind of emerged from the pages and I encountered him. And that was a life-changing moment. I knew Jesus was real. I struggled with how can it be true, because logically it can't be true. And I sort of had to think, well, I'm just going to take this step of faith, even though I haven't got any answer to my philosophical belief system that tells me there can't be a God. But I sort of thought, well, I just said yes to Jesus, basically. It wasn't a formal prayer. It was just like, yes, okay. And at that moment I experienced, I suppose, like all the things that deep down I'd been hungry for were filled. Jesus said, I'm the bread of life. And it was like there was a spiritual hunger that I'd never realized was there, even, that was satisfied. And I think a lot of the things I've been doing before was trying to fill that spiritual hunger with things that never worked, all that partying, and it didn't really satisfy all the sort of very superficial relationships that I had before. It was a very superficial life with hindsight, and it didn't fill the gap. I mean, it was fun in a way, but it was quite empty. And I think the moment I encountered Jesus, it was like, Jesus is the way, he's the truth, he's the life. This is what life is about.
I think I want to dig a little bit deeper, because for someone who's never heard of this before, they would think, well, you've spent your whole life arguing against the existence of God. Then you spend 2 days reading this Bible that you've had and has been gathering dust on the shelf, and you suddenly have this 180-degree shift. So was it an emotional change? I think you were studying existentialism as well.
You've done your research. You really have. Amazing. I was reading a bit of Jean-Paul Sartre at the time. Yeah, I suppose it was extraordinary. I mean, it was, I suppose, I haven't thought of it like this, but if you think Paul was off to persecute Christians on the road to Damascus, It didn't even take 2 days. It was like immediate. And I think for me, it was a bit like that. It was as if Jesus he didn't physically appear to me like he appeared to Paul, but it was sort of in my heart, he did. At the moment I said yes, I didn't know it was true. But a few seconds afterwards, I did. It was kind of like, I knew it was true. And an analogy I sometimes use is I did this case once at Knightsbridge Crown Court. I prosecuted a man who was accused of stealing jewelry from Harvey Nichols. And the only evidence against him was his fingerprints. And now fingerprints, no two human beings have the same fingerprints. Even twins don't have the same fingerprints. So normally, if you find someone's fingerprints, they plead guilty. But he didn't plead guilty because he said, yes, I was in Harvey Nichols with my girlfriend. We went to the jewelry store and I was looking at jewelry, and that's why my fingerprints were there. And I didn't know whether the jury could have believed that. They had to take a step of faith. They weren't there based on the evidence of his fingerprints. And they actually did convict him. They found him guilty. After he was found guilty, the police officer got into the dock to give his previous convictions, because you're not allowed to tell them, or you weren't then allowed to tell people about previous convictions. He had a page and a half of previous convictions for stealing jewelry from department stores, and he was awaiting trial for 2 further cases of stealing jewelry from department stores. And you could see the jury's face. They took a step of faith based on the evidence, but when they heard that, they knew they were right. And for me, it was like before, it was like a step of faith based on the evidence. But the moment I made that decision, it was like, I knew. It was the confirmation, the Spirit, I guess, gave a confirmation that Jesus is real. It is true.
So once you took that step of faith and you sound like you were so on fire for God, I imagine the first thing you must have done was try and find other people who were also on fire for God. So
Yes.
how did you build that community, and how do you end up in Kitchen with Phil, Lawson, Johnston?
So yes, I suppose. Now, I mean, the first thing I wanted to do was to tell all my friends, like, it's true. But by the way, guys, I'm the atheist. It's true. And quite a few people at that time did become Christians, not necessarily through me, but through what was happening. But a lot of them didn't. Funnily enough, now they have much, and some of them were very dismissive. They thought this is a phase, God squad, all that. They're much more respectful now, like 47 years later. Well, they know it's not a phase. It's not just a passing phase. If it is a phase, it's a very long phase. But yes, there was a mixed reaction. How did I end up at the Kitchen? So I started going, when I left university, I started looking for sort of churches to go to. And during that time, it was in 1976, this place had opened in Petersham Place, which is not far from where my parents live, not far from where we are now, actually, here at HTBB. And it was started by 7 people, including Phil, Lawson, Johnston. And it was in the house of a guy called Mickey Anstrother Goth Cawthorne. And it was 7 people, I think all of whom, Mickey sadly died, but the others are still alive and are still all around. And basically what Mickey did is he had a garage in his house in Petersham Place, and it was a mews house, and he turned the garage into a restaurant, and it was a place where people could go and just eat, and you didn't have to pay. There was a basket, you could give a contribution, and there was a book, and you signed your name in that book. And I went one evening to eat there, and I looked in the book, and the first name in the book was Philippa Hislop, which was Pippa's maiden name. And she was the first guest there. She hadn't been a Christian, but it was designed for people who weren't Christians to go in and eat there and meet the people and become friends. And they would have a service on Sundays in the garage. Just like 30 people gathering to worship. And so, yeah, that was the Kitchen.
And what was it like? Because it sounded like it was very spirit-filled to the point where Sandy Miller popped in.
Sandy had just come as the curate to HTB, and HTB was not a church I thought of joining, although it was literally, I guess, 300 yards from my parents' house. But I wouldn't have thought of going to it because it was not one which had a reputation for life, spiritual life. But Sandy had arrived there, and I went to a service to meet him because I heard he'd been a barrister, and I was planning to be a barrister at that stage. So I met him after the service, and he asked me to, he asked me to everything, basically, because I think I was the first young person to come to the church. And there was no one else in the church at Brompton Road who was under 50. And I think he's, when he saw a young person arrive, he asked me to lunch, tea, supper. And he started a small group with 6 people, including Caroline Eaton, she was then, now Caroline Welby. And that's when I first met Caroline. And that little group grew. After about 3 months, Nicky and Scylla Lee, who'd been at another church, came and joined us. And then various others came who'd been at Cambridge, came and joined. And that group grew and grew. And then it divided. Nicky and Scylla took a group from it and started their own group. And then eventually, quite a bit later, Pippa and I took a group from there and started our own little group. But that group grew and grew. It was a midweek group. But then Sandy persuaded Phil, who had been at the kitchen, to come and start leading worship at HTB. And there'd never been that kind of informal guitar-led worship before, and that started to make a difference. And then he started an evening service with Phil leading worship. So what was happening at the kitchen then kind of switched away from the kitchen to Brompton Road, and that was the start of a movement which just grew and grew and is still growing, I think.
I imagine it must have been quite a shock when Phil joins. I mean, Phil, I saw an interview he did once. He described it as one of the very first contemporary Christian worship moments. And you contrast that with what HTB had at the time, which was robed choir services in the morning. So the reaction must have been quite extreme at the time to have.
There was no other Church of England church doing what Sandy was doing. So it was unique, I think. I may be wrong, but I think there was nothing else in 1976 quite like it. It's still going on, but the change is still happening. But it was the start of something. Informality. What Sandy realized was that the culture was informal. He would always say, when he was young, he would come down to Sunday lunch wearing a suit and tie. And he said, his children don't do that anymore. The culture has changed. Look at me, I'm not wearing a suit. I'm not wearing a tie.
I don't think I've ever seen you in a suit.
No, well, because it's an informal culture. And what Sandy was saying is, if the church is going to be relevant to an informal culture, we have to be relevant to that culture. And therefore we have to adapt the way that we do church, the informality. And that was why he got rid of the robe choir. He didn't get rid, the robe choir were paid, and all they did was stop paying them. That was the only thing he did. They could have still sung. A couple of them kept on coming, but he just stopped paying people to lead worship in that sense. The fact is, they wouldn't have come if they hadn't been paid. I remember it so well. They would sit, when they'd done their singing, they'd get a book out and sit in the choir stalls reading their book. They weren't interested in church. They were just interested in being paid for singing. When they went, that changed the atmosphere. But that was a lot later. That was much later.
So you were really active in church. And after you graduated, did you not feel as though you wanted to go into ministry full-time immediately?
I did. In 1976, I thought about it. Funny enough, I came across a prayer diary yesterday. In 1976, I did think about it straight away, but it just didn't work out. I saw the bishop and he wasn't interested. He basically kind of just didn't encourage me in any way. So then that door was sort of shut. So I went off and trained to be a barrister. And then I did almost 10 years law from when I started law at university to when I left.